Welcome, everybody. You're all extremely welcome to this Dublin Lunar New Year event. I will give people one more minute to join us, and then I will formally introduce this evening's lecture. Well, welcome, and I think we can begin. My name is Dr. Isabella Jackson. I am joining you from the Trinity Centre for Asian Studies, and I want to wish everybody an extremely happy Year of the Tiger, and also a happy St. Bridget's Day, as we will be talking here about Chinese women and Chinese mothers. It seems appropriate to acknowledge the Mother Saint of Ireland today. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be introducing Dr. Yushu Geng to you, our lecturer for this evening. Dr. Geng received her PhD from Cambridge, University of Cambridge last year, where she was working on obscenity in early 20th century Singapore and China, doing very original work, and an article arising from that research has already been published on obscenity, morality and modernity in 1920s China. And she is actually part of our team working at Trinity as a research fellow on the Irish Research Council funded China Child project. And Dr. Geng's research focuses on girlhood and womanhood as depicted in advertisements in 1920s China. So doing very interesting research. And I think we're going to learn a lot this evening, where Dr. Geng will be talking to us specifically on the title From Wise Mother, Good Wife to Tiger Mum, Women in 20th Century China. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Geng.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for joining me tonight virtually, and thanks for the really nice intro, Isabella. So I'll just share my screen now. Yeah. Okay, right. So as a historian of modern China with a specific research interest in women's history and gender history, when I was given this opportunity to deliver a public talk in celebration of the Year of the Tiger, I immediately thought of the word tiger mom. The term tiger mom, referring to a super strict style of parenting practiced by Chinese moms, was coined by Chinese American law professor Amy Chua. Amy Chua was born in the Year of the Tiger, and that's one of the reasons why she called herself a tiger mom. She is a professor at Yale Law School and published her memoir, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, in 2011. The book was a bestseller not just in America, but also internationally. It also generated a global debate about different parenting styles and different cultures that fostered such different parenting techniques. This memoir has been translated into 30 languages, Chinese included. Here is the mainland China edition. The cover of the book features a photo of Amy Chua in front of the American flag. And the Chinese title is actually different from the original English one. It reads, Being a Mother in America, Parenting by a Yale Law Professor. I have to admit, I had mixed feelings when I was reading it. Reading it as a daughter, I was really grateful that my own mother was not such a tiger mom. She was born in the Year of the Rabbit, and well, she could be pushy sometimes, but not as intense as Amy Chua. I don't think I could survive under such a tiger mom parenting. But reading it as a historian, I couldn't help but marvel at how much has changed in the 20th century and how much remained the same. Chinese women have not always been tiger moms, but motherhood has continued to be such a huge part of a woman's identity and life, even today. The expectations placed by state, by society, by men and by women themselves on women and mothers have changed as China changed from an imperial empire to a republic. then to a communist state, and eventually to its present form. My following talk will be a whistle-stop tour, introducing you to some remarkable moments in changing motherhood and womanhood ideals in China's long 20th century. So although this talk is mostly about the 20th century, but I want to briefly discuss motherhood in imperial China. Women did not always have the privilege of making their thoughts, voices, and perspectives public, especially in the imperial times. So what we know about women in imperial China mostly come from men's writings. Writings about women overwhelmingly glorified motherhood, as well as a mother's influence on her children, especially after the 11th century. Definitions of proper feminine virtue in didactic texts and biographies became more narrowly defined as increasing emphasis was placed on chastity, filiality, and motherhood. Mothers in late imperial China were often depicted as a symbol of virtue and suffering. A model mom was responsible for ordinary housekeeping, such as doing daily chores, taking care of the children, and serving the elders. While fathers could be absent from children's upbringing, it was mothers that remained constantly responsible for nursing, feeding, disciplining, and instructing. One such model mom in imperial China is Mencius's mom. Mencius is a prominent Confucian philosopher during the Zhou dynasty. His mother was a widow and raised Mencius on her own. Legend has it that she moved houses 3 times and eventually settled down in a place near a school, which she felt would be most suitable to inspire the young Mencius to study. So one reason why mothers were so involved and invested in their sons' education was that in the traditional society hierarchy, social hierarchy in imperial China, a woman could hardly acquire any public acclaim for herself. The personal ambitions she had and the social recognition she desired, she had to achieve through men, and her son was the most promising candidate for realizing her wishes. In the past 3 decades, revisionist historians have done much to debunk the myth that women in pre-modern China were passive victims under an unchanging Confucian patriarchy, showing that women's lives could be shaped by their own choices and participation in family and social life. As historians benefited from hindsight, today we see that this narrative of traditional Chinese women as powerless victims is not entirely historically accurate, but this notion that traditional Chinese women were backward was hugely influential among intellectuals in the late 19th century. One good example is Liang Qichao's On Women's Education. Published in 1897, you can see a photo of Liang Qichao here. So Liang Qichao is perhaps one of the most famous late Qing reformers who advocated for constitutional monarchy and was a major participant in the reform movement of 1898, also known as the 100 Days of Reform, as it was how long it roughly lasted. During the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty faced both internal uprisings, rising tide of anti-Manchu Han nationalism, as well as continuing pressure from Western imperial powers for commercial privileges in China. So it was against this background of profound national crisis that Chinese male reformers, such as Liang Qichao, began to address the women question as part of a wider exploration of why and how the country had declined to its present state. On Women's Education was published as part of Liang Qichao's series of essays on how to reform and strengthen China. Liang argued that China's entire female population was unproductive and therefore a drain on the household and national economy, which was not entirely historically accurate, as Liang Qichao completely overlooked the crucial roles peasant women had always played in the rural economy. So for Liang Qichao, parasitic, ignorant, and physically weak Chinese women were not only a major cause of China's decline, but also constituted a threat to China's future because of Chinese women's inability to bear and raise healthy and public-spirited sons. Well, as we can see in Liang Qichao's argument, it was based on very much instrumentalist grounds. Reformers at that time focused primarily on the need to educate women so that they could be better moms and produce better future citizens. Women's own independence and well-being was now usually the top priority in most men's writings about the woman question. However, as women themselves came to participate in the discourse at the turn of the 20th century, emphasis was also placed on the necessity for women to struggle for political rights and to be actively involved in public affairs. Qiu Jin was one such woman. Qiu Jin was from a scholar gentry family in Zhejiang province. She had married a minor bureaucrat and moved to Beijing around 1902. Witnessing foreign troops entering Beijing in the wake of the Boxer Uprising, she composed poetry expressing her dismay at China's decline, bemoaning the fact that the Chinese people were asleep and needed to be goaded into action to save the nation. In 1904, she virtually abandoned her husband and 2 children to go to study in Japan. In Japan, she soon became involved in political activity and joined Sun Yat-sen's new anti-Qing political organization, the Tongmenghui Alliance League, in 1905. Here is a photo of Qiu Jin in Western male suit taken when she was studying in Japan. So unlike Liang Qichao and other male reformers who often advocated women's rights in terms of allowing them to play a crucial role as mothers of citizens, Qiu Jin believed that only by taking part in the anti-Manchu revolution would women emancipate themselves and ultimately gain equal rights as citizens. For Qiu Jin, Han Chinese women were doubly enslaved, firstly by the Manchus and other foreigners, and secondly by men. Moreover, Qiu Jin highlighted the need for women to achieve economic independence and autonomy, and by doing so, reducing their dependence on men and reinforce their own self-worth. There were also other kinds of female voices. For example, some stress the importance of physical education for women, arguing that it should be seen primarily as a source of women's own empowerment rather than an activity to benefit the nation per se or ensure the health of future progeny. Well, I want to make a quick clarification here. Although I named this slide Women's Voices, the gender discourse in this period cannot be divided simply along the men versus women binary. I was reading an article on women's education written by Kang Tongwei, who was Kang Youwei's daughter, another quite famous Latin reformer. And I was really amazed how she basically paraphrased what Liang Qichao was saying in his article. So reading her article was like reading a photocopy of Liang Qichao's on women's education. You can't always distinguish a man's voice versus a woman's voice. And I suppose the larger question this raised is that, is there a gender way of speaking and writing? Well, women's voice is problematic. I use it here nonetheless for the sake of structural clarity, but I still need to highlight that it is a deeply problematic concept. Years preceding the 1911 revolution, women in China became more politically active. Women participated in mass rallies, boycotts, created associations to encourage financial contributions from a female constituency, now specifically referred to as women's circles or 女国民, female citizens. In the wake of the revolution, China's first female suffrage associations were also formed. These women believed that participating in the revolution against the imperial monarchy would give them rightful claims for gender equality, such as voting rights. However, the new republic sort of betrayed these women. The electoral laws passed in 1912 excluded women as voters or candidates. And the early years of the republic were to be marked by a wave of gender conservatism, which represented a reaction against women's growing public visibility and activism since the late 19th century. Early Republican discourses on the rationale for women's education stressed the importance of domesticity and the need for skilled, knowledgeable, modest, and diligent household managers to ensure stable, harmonious, and prosperous families and the proper education of children. We could see such a discourse emerging in early Republican women's journals. So two of the most popular and durable of such journals were the Ladies' Times, 妇女时报, and Ladies' Magazine, 妇女杂志. These journals, to which both men and women contributed articles, provided information on such matters as children's psychology, household budgeting and hygiene, and culinary techniques, as well as translating articles from American and British middle-class women's magazines that promoted the virtues of skilled and frugal housewifery. In the view of many of the contributors, girls' schools would be the primary site in which students would acquire the appropriate skills and the demeanor and outlook necessary for successful household management in the future. So here, this cover of Ladies' Times is the vivid visual summary of contemporary valorization of the good wife, wise mother ideal. Moving towards the new culture and May 4th period, we see the emergence of a new kind of ideal womanhood. It was during the May 4th period that the term new woman, 新女性, began to be commonly used. The term new woman was first introduced to the Chinese audience by Hu Shi in 1918. Hu Shi was a prominent scholar of the Republican period, and you can see here, this is a photo of him. So basically, Hu describes the new woman as someone with high-minded morals who transcended traditional gender spheres and displayed intellectual and economic independence. Yet, there was no consensus about the meaning or value of the new woman at this time. Up until the 1920s, modern or new women could suggest the earlier politically motivated women, such as the suffragists, the independent career women, the educated women of high morals who retained personal autonomy in marriage, as in Hu Shi's definition, or even the skilled, knowledgeable, and diligent middle-class housewife. By the late 1920s, the modern girl, the modern woman had also become a symbol of glamour, fashion, and desirability. The modern girl, the term coined for this type of modern woman, had negative connotations of shallow westernization and selfish hedonism, especially for male intellectuals from both the left and the right. The modern girl in new sensationalist novels of the 1930s, for example, was depicted as dangerous but alluring femme fatale, leading an unstrained lifestyle in the city, who seduced and then abandoned the hapless male narrator. Although some historians have stated that the new woman and modern girl figures have been constructed as a dichotomy, with the former representing the positive aspects of modernity and the latter the dark side of modernity, the line between the new woman and the modern girl was actually extremely blurred. Lu Xun's short story, Mourning the Dead, which was published in 1925, was a good example. This story documented the union and later breakup of a young couple. The male protagonist, Juan Sheng, fell in love with a new woman, Zijuan, who was intelligent with progressive ideas and broke from her traditional family to marry him. Their marriage in many ways ticked all the boxes of a May 4th ideal marriage. It was not arranged by parents. They loved each other and shared similar values, such as the importance of individuality and independence, and as well as personhood. But after they got married, Juan Sheng could not earn enough money to provide for their small family and found Zijuan increasingly a burden. He thought that Zijun has changed and wasn't progressive after all. The story ended as Zijun was brought back home by her family and soon died. After her funeral, Juan Sheng expressed his sorrow, regrets, but also his determination to start his new life. I personally love this story as it touches on the very real dilemma that new women or modern girl faced in real life. The story also shows how malleable the new woman and modern girl identity was. One could easily lose her modernness, which in many sense was defined by men. And Lu Xun has discussed the difficulties women seeking autonomy faced in real life in another talk. In 1923, Lu Xun gave a talk at Beijing Women's Normal College titled "After Nora Works Out, What Then?" In this talk, he posed the question of how the independent woman would survive after she left home. Without the opportunity of gaining genuine economic independence, Lu Xun suggested she was destined either to return home or to fall into prostitution. For this reason, he suggested the struggle for women's economic autonomy was more urgent than that for political rights. And the Nora here refers to the female protagonist of Ibsen's play Adolf's House. Nora eventually walked out of his house and husband, realizing that it had been a cage for her. This play was enormously popular among the May 4th generation, and Nora became the symbol of the struggle of the individual in society to escape the confines of the traditional family. In many ways, male radicals during the May 4th period were drawn to the women question as a way of subliminally addressing their own frustrations. So by highlighting the oppressed status and the victimization of women in society, they expressed their personal feelings of powerlessness. As historian Louis Edwards has quite convincingly argued, male intellectuals' preoccupation with defining the right, moral, ideal womanhood for Chinese women was the result of their own anxieties over their marginalized position in a polity that increasingly favored military men and businessmen in the modernization process of China. And for these reasons, I also want to stress that we shouldn't read the wise mother, good wife, new women, and modern girl icons in a simple progressive versus backward binary narrative. Instead of labeling housewives as backward and traditional, we need to think about the limited job opportunities available to women at that time. For those who find a job, either as a white-collar one or working in factories, they faced continuous gender discrimination, such as unequal pay, and the lack of public childcare facilities meant that many had to choose between family and career. Despite the multiplicity in gender discourses in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the wise mother and good wife ideal continued to be widely accepted and celebrated. Women have been mobilized by both the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the Nationalist Party during the National Revolution to end the rule of the warlords. However, after the nationalists established a new government in Nanjing in 1927, we once again saw the resurgence of gender conservatism. The Nationalist Party's campaign to promote traditional feminine virtues was a central element of the new new life movement in 1934 to 1935, drawing on both Prussian-style military values and Confucian ethics. The New Life movement aimed to instill the habits of discipline and hard work into the Chinese population, as well as civilized ways of behaving and dressing. The ideal modern woman promoted by the Nationalist Party was a skilled, loyal, and conscientious domestic manager and nurturer who provided loyal support for her husband. Such a womanhood ideal represented a reaction against both the politicized women and the urban modern women associated with Western style fashion and consumerism. After the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the nationalist government continued to promote this good wife, wise mother ideal. In the 1940s, endorsing the idea that women's field is their households, not politics, the Central Organization Department promoted the Mujiao movement. Mujiao meant education by mother. And in 1941, at the opening event of the Women's Leaders Forum in Chongqing, the minister in charge of the Central Organization Department stated that it was wrong to take women's political movement as the only means to achieve women's liberation. Instead, he urged women to play their traditional gender roles in the wartime society, especially at home, so that their husband would be able to play their roles more efficiently in public. Such a call of women going home upset many female activists. Shen Zijun, for example, criticized really harshly the messages delivered by the minister at the Women Leaders Forum. She wrote, so here, please allow me to conclude this forum. After women's organizations have been consolidated and women members have been well-trained and enrolled in the Nationalist Party, the only task left for the rest of us is to have babies. And regarding women's political participation, all we need to do is to place a few women in the Nationalist Party to decorate the party, like a vase used to decorate a room. The Mujiao movement also stirred up strong protests among the communists. In 1942, Zhou Enlai, who was to become the premier of the Chinese Republic of China after 1949, published an article entitled On Good Wives, Wise Mothers, and the Duties of Motherhood to criticize the reoccurring discourse of good wife and wise mother. In this article, Zhou Enlai pointed out that the notion good wife and wise mother was a product of the patriarchy society that functioned as shackles on women. The fact that there was no notion of good husbands and wise fathers revealed the patriarchal roots of good wife and wise mother ideal. Zhou Enlai argued that instead of discussing good wife and wise mother, we should discuss the duties of motherhood and the duties of wifehood separately. For this approach to this issue would also help to bring up the question of the duties of fatherhood and the duties of husbandhood. Zhou Enlai also questioned the call for Mujiao and suggested the responsibility of childcare and education should be shouldered by the entire society rather than only by women themselves. He also argued that the duties of motherhood did not mean women should not have a career or equal political rights. In his own words, women's maternal role is natural and intrinsic to their status as mothers. However, we are against using maternal role as an excuse to prevent women from developing a career or to deprive women of their equal and political rights. Those who argued in favor of the exclusion of women from having a career and political rights were simply supporters of patriarchy. Early on, the Chinese Communist Party has incorporated the agenda of women's emancipation into its political program. May 4th feminist thought had profound influence on early male leaders of the CCP, such as Chen Duxiu. During the party's early years, Marxism and feminism were not perceived as necessarily incompatible. This meant that the early CCP supported women's suffrage campaign and participated in a nationwide organization set up in 1922, the Women's Rights League, 女权运动同盟会. In doing so, the party played an important role in bringing women's groups together and facilitating women's social mobilization on an unprecedented scale. In many ways, the CCP at this time also represented a kind of radical subculture in which members sought to reconstitute social relationships, including gender ones, along egalitarian lines. This made the party especially attractive as a potential haven for young women, especially those who desperately wanted to escape the control of their families or to avoid the fate of an arranged marriage. During the high socialism period in China, a series of movements launched by the CCP had also had profound influence on women. One such example would be the Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1961. The Great Leap Forward was an attempt to break with the Soviet model of development by decentralizing economic decision-making, industrializing the countryside through the agency of rural communes, and shifting educational and health resources from urban centers to rural areas. An integral aspect of the Great Leap Forward was the wholesale mobilization of women in production, especially in the countryside. both to take advantage, well, in Mao Zedong's bill, both to take advantage of China's untapped reservoir of human labor and to fulfill the Engosian prediction that women's participation in productive labor would inevitably lead to gender equality. It was also expected that the creation of communal dining house, daycare centers, and nurseries under the People's Commune would allow women to benefit from the socialization of housework. Overall, the Great Leap Forward witnessed a massive increase in women's participation in agriculture, especially as in many areas, men were drawn away to work on construction projects. In the urban areas, the commune movement encouraged the development of street industries, which was responsible for the production of daily consumer items, such as cooking implements. These street industries principally employed women, usually housewives. In the early 1960s, women had become highly visible in factories and government offices. The popular Mao era slogan, as we can see here, women hold up half the sky, summed up the spirit of that time perfectly. The official propaganda tried to convey the message that women were just as capable as men. For such reasons, many historians have characterized the Cultural Revolution period as a period of androgyny. Cultural Revolution androgyny was exemplified by the female Red Guards and the Iron Girls. The female Red Guards, dressed like their male counterparts and hair cut short, participated enthusiastically in public shaming and sometimes physical assault of revisionist enemies such as party bureaucrats, teachers, and intellectuals. Iron Girls were model female workers, usually young and unmarried, who in the propaganda were deemed as capable as men in performing heavy and dangerous work. So later testimonies of former Iron Girls noted how their experiences as Iron Girls have empowered them. But this is not to say that socialist China was a paradise for women, for all women. It was definitely not the case. Conventional gender patterns and attitudes continue to exist both within the party organization and within the wider society. There were episodes of gender conservatism in communist China, especially in the early and mid-1950s. Quite ironically, in the countryside, while women's labor were mobilized to contribute to the countryside collectivization, in the city, women were being urged to stay at home during this period. The Five Good campaign, launched in 1955, promoted the virtues of the socialist housewife, one who managed the household well, ensured harmony among family members, and brought up children conscientiously. Conventional gender patterns and attitude also posed challenges for women entering the productive labor. On the one hand, by late 1958, it was reported that in most places, up to 90% of women were involved in collective labor. This meant, however, that they worked longer hours and more days than ever before. Also, conventional notions of the appropriate gender division of labor disadvantaged women. Certain activities such as weeding, working on small irrigation projects, and working in the communal dining house and nurseries were designated as women's tasks, and thus allocated fewer work points than supposedly heavier and more skilled work performed by men. And in 1942, the female writer Ding Ling publicly criticized the CCP policy on women in an article titled Thoughts on March 8. March 8 was the International Women's Day. So in this article, Ding Ling called into question the party's commitment or ability to change popular attitudes towards women. In particular, she satired male double standards concerning women, stating that on the one hand, women were ridiculed if as Nora's returning home, if they focused on household and maternal duties. But if women remained unmarried and worked alongside men in the public sphere, they were often the target of malicious gossip and rumors. Dingling also pointedly referred to the arbitrary manner in which male cadres made use of divorce provisions in the law to get rid of backward wives. Dingling's article was wrongly condemned by Mao Zedong and the party leaders, and she was forced to retract her views and undergo a public self-confession, which is a graphic illustration of how difficult it was to advance a critique of or an alternative view to the CCP's stated policy on women. A central tension in CCP's gender policy is the tension between gender and class. From the beginning, female leaders in CCP often found themselves under the pressure to subordinate the cause of women in general to that of the proletarian revolution. And moreover, women, just like any other groups, was not a homogeneous group. When we talk about women's lived experiences, we need to think about how age, generational gap, race, geographic location, as well as socioeconomic background affected their experiences, even though they have both lived through the same period. So during the Cultural Revolution period, while a certain group of young female students, female regards, gained unprecedented mobility, many women, especially intellectuals and political figures, suffered greatly during this period. Violence against individuals often took the form of sexual humiliation. A prominent victim of such humiliation was Wang Guangmei, the wife of the former president Liu Shaoqi, who himself charged with being the #1 revisionist in the party and purged at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So Wang Guangmei was accused of decadent bourgeois revisionism and described as an evil vixen spirit who infatuated men, because she had worn qipao while accompanying her husband on a state visit to Indonesia in 1963. She was forced in front of a Beijing crowd to wear an ill-fitting qipao. Sorry, I didn't explain what qipao is. It's basically a modern Chinese dress. It became quite figure-hugging later, but was still quite modest in the 1920s and 1930s. So she was forced to wear an ill-fitting qipao, high-heeled shoes, as well as a necklace of ping pong balls, signifying that she was a prostitute. Well, although Maoist era was definitely not the paradise for all women, but it was still a special chapter in the history of women's emancipation in China. In the post-Mao period, after 1976, much of the Maoist ideological legacy was rejected by the CCP, and market reform was encouraged in all areas of the economy. Underpinning these market-oriented reforms was a significant change in ideology without, however, calling into question the legitimacy of one-party rule. Maoist stress on class struggle and the concept of permanent revolution was rejected, and people were exhorted by the party and the state authorities to get rich, now viewed as a glorious task in the construction of a prosperous country. Many of the gender stereotypes rooted in biological essentialism and dating from the early years of the 20th century were to be revived, while if indeed they had ever been entirely eliminated in the Maoist period. So women's political presence was gradually to decline after 1976. The CCP in the years following the Cultural Revolution decade became very much a male-dominated body. The assumption that women's political activism during the Cultural Revolution had been excessive and at the expense of fulfilling more important and natural duties was very much in evidence at the 4th Congress of the Women's Federation in 1978. A few months earlier, in an editorial of a party journal, it was declared that women workers, commune members, and women scientists need to work and study hard, but they have to spend a considerable portion of their time tending to housework and children. At the Congress itself, this agenda was reaffirmed in the report submitted by Kang Ke-qing, who was the widow of Zhu De, the co-founder of the Red Army, and who was also an important figure in the CCP. So signifying a clear departure from the Cultural Revolution motto that anything a man can do, a woman can do. Kang Ke-qing's report suggested that in the current era of reform, women's role was to be secondary and supportive rather than acquiring new technical skills. Kang Ke-qing argued that women's traditional skills needed to be harnessed in order to construct a wide network of childcare institutions, public canteens, and laundries. Kang Ke-qing also repeated the conventional assumption, which was quite popular in the mid-1950s, that household chores and childcare were the responsibility primarily of the wife. In her own words, mother's duties are the most glorious natural duties for women in human society. Women can do anything that human beings can do. However, since mother's duties are inevitable, women may do fewer things. This is not only permissible, but also necessary in the division of labor. We see that in this period, the family has been reaffirmed as the basic social institution by the CCP. One of the state projects to establish and promote exemplary motherhood to encourage moral regeneration and the social harmonization is China's 10 Outstanding Mothers campaign in 2006. The campaign was not a grassroots movement and pretty much controlled by the official party state. Therefore, it was more a reflection of the party's value system and propaganda rather than the popular attitudes towards women and motherhood. According to the selection criteria, these outstanding mothers must be dedicated patriots, loyal supporters of the CCP, independent and self-supporting career women, successful managers or entrepreneurs, good neighbor, and or voluntary social workers who extend their motherly love to society and have a strong sense of social responsibility. Well, in a sense, women are placed under the triple burden of work, family, and society. I find it interesting that Amy Chua actually fit into many criteria listed here for the outstanding mothers, except that she's probably not a very loyal supporter of the CCP. I guess another thing I found fascinating when I was reading Amy Chua's parenting memoir was her ability to multitask. She's a law professor, and as a woman in academia, I know how hectic it is. But she also spends so many hours accompanying her daughters to their music classes, and practicing with them. Their family had 2 dogs, and Amy Chua wrote in a matter-of-fact way that 90% of the time, she was the one taking care of the 2 dogs. I suppose I was really amazed at how naturally this tiger mom took all these, the triple burden of work, family, and society. And this brings me to the end of my talk. The stories I have just told do not bring us to a black and white conclusion. The story of changing womanhood and motherhood in 20th century China shows that women's emancipation was never a linear progression from the dark age to the bright future. What we see from what we have been discussing is a long discursive tradition in 20th century China that had appropriate women as a trope for larger concerns and anxieties. For example, anxieties over the survival of the nation and of the race, anxieties over cultural and national identities, or the pace of modernizing change. What these debates over womanhood and motherhood ideals effectively shows is that the body of women became a site where we see competing visions of modernity. Reformers, intellectuals, nationalists, communists, men and women all once had a say in these changing discourses. But it is important to note that women still pretty much live under a patriarchal system. perhaps more so as the state grew more powerful, as revealed in the double or even triple burden women continue to shoulder throughout the 20th century. So thanks for listening. Happy the Year of the Tiger.
Thank you very much indeed, Yushu. That was a tour de force, absolutely fascinating, and you covered a lot of ground, but I think everyone will have really learned a lot. We now have just under 15 minutes for questions, and I would invite members of the audience to put these into the Q&A box as they occur to you. We've already had a couple of questions come in, but if I may, I'm going to take the chair's privilege of posing a question first of all, because I was really struck at the beginning of your lecture, Yushu, where you talked about Liang Qichao's characteristic dismissive attitude towards women, that they were completely unproductive and contributing nothing to society. And you pointed out that, you know, he was ignoring the fact that women labored, but also he's completely ignoring there the huge amount of work that goes into domestic labor and raising children. So my question is, to what extent did the emergence of the good wife, wise mother trope mean that role of women was better valued? We're familiar with it being used as a way to kind of constrain women, I think, in that era, that they were supposed to, devote themselves to being, if you like, just wives and mothers, and that all the improvements that they might focus on would be confined to those roles. But did that go along with recognizing that it was a lot of work to do those jobs well, and that they were they were sort of work in a form, even if they weren't economic productive labor. A bit like, you know, the meaning of the phrase of women holding up half the sky, even if it wasn't reflected in the reality in that later Mao period.
Yeah, I feel like that's one thing I find fascinating about Liang Qichao's women's education, because basically there are so many self-contradictory points that he was raising. On the one hand, he really detested traditional Chinese women who are like who he accused of being not productive and illiterate. But we knew that like Chinese women, especially the elite women, were actually educated and played a huge role in their children's education process. But on the other hand, as you just mentioned, what Liang Qichao was promoting was kind of a different version of good wife, wise mother. So wise in the sense that more educated Chinese women, and perhaps Chinese women who don't have their feet bound would be better moms. So I guess that's the contradiction I saw in Liang Qichao's text. On the one hand, he's valorized this motherhood ideal, but on the other hand, he's kind of saying that this is bad in the past, and that was the reason why China has declined. I think, well, even is obviously in the later period, housewives didn't really receive such a good reputation. For you remember the title Tai Tai, that was quite commonly used in left-wing literature as a way to denote a negative perception of women who are housewives. I think it's quite prevalent in left-wing writing. But definitely, yeah, I think that's quite the gap between the ideal and reality. While the official ideology in women's magazines or the party journals praised the good wife, wise mother ideal, but in reality, people's popular attitudes towards housewives were not always quite warm.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's obviously not unique to China or to that period, certainly. I'll go through some of the questions that are coming in now. So Louisa wants to know about arranged marriages and if that practice persists at all in China today.
My gut feeling is that it's not a strict, it's not arranged marriage by the strict definition that you, like, for example, you haven't met your future partner. There is no consensus between the two parties who are going to get married, but because there will be certain softer versions of arranged marriage. For example, parents or family or friends introducing potential matches to each other. And also because China is such a huge country, so I can't really say that it didn't exist in all parts. And I do see softer versions of arranged marriage exist today. And back to the Republican period, even that period when they were saying that we should ban, the May 4th youth was saying that we should ban arranged marriage, but in practice, it's actually quite popular as the traditional way of forming a family was still quite influential. Even during the high period of May 4th activism, when the young men and women were saying that we want we want love, we want romance, they would still ask their parents for their approval of their marriage.
Yes, and certainly when I was living in China a few years ago, you would see in the big central parks parents coming together, kind of advertising their daughters and sons to one another for introductions. You know, they would, as you say, they wouldn't have been arranging a marriage with no consent from the children, but they would be on the lookout on behalf of their children for a suitable match, and then hoping to introduce them and hope that things would go on from there. So in that sense, the parental involvement in a marriage continues. Thank you. So Ila Ma asks, as a Chinese mother herself, she says, I know that tiger mothers are really common in China, and I would like to ask if the tiger mother is common in Western society.
Yeah, I think so. That's one thing Amy Chua was trying to clarify in her book in the very beginning. She was saying that tiger mom was not unique to Chinese mothers. Well, she saw Irish parents or like East Asian Korean parents or Pakistan families practicing this strict parenting style. So it's not something exclusive to Chinese parents, definitely.
Michael Oxford asks a potentially huge question. What does the current discourse of women in China look like today compared to 100 years ago? But then he helpfully gives us a slightly smaller parameter with the second part of his question. He read about the declining birth rate in China and asked how significant that is to the discourse of women.
Yeah, again, it's my gut feeling. Well, not so educated guesses. I feel like nowadays the tension between the two genders, not two genders, between men and women in China is kind of intensified, and the decline in birth rate was quite alarming for the state as they ended the one-child policy in 2015, if I remember correctly, and they promoted the two-child policy, and now it's the two-children policy, and now it's the three-children policy. So, but despite that, I think the birth rate in China continued to decline, which is telling of how women were not really happy about getting married and having babies, as I think most of them now are beginning to realize what a huge commitment it was, and without accompanying social welfare system to ensure that they would be able to go back to their job after giving birth, I think the state is not going to solve the problem immediately, and which is also quite telling of the difference between a contemporary discourse on women, especially how women perceive themselves, and in comparison to what was it like 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, it was during a time of national crisis, and purely judging from the textual evidence, it seems like lots of women were quite happy to sacrifice themselves for the nation. Well, it's all talks. We don't really know how many of them will actually do it, but it's just the general atmosphere was like that during time of crisis. And now we are not actually living in a national crisis. We don't really see immediate imperial advancement or war. So I think individualism, especially more individualistic ideas have been more dominant among women. So it's a different form of feminism, I suppose, different from the early nationalistic feminism that was popular in China in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Yes, and in terms of the way women are discussed, there's a lot of criticism coming from the government and media and so on in China of women for not having more children, for not making the choices that government now wants them to make, and the discourse of the leftover women. If you're 27 and not married, then you are on the shelf. Officially, this is a kind of official designation. So in some ways, the landscape has become more restrictive, at least officially, or compared to what was being pushed from the elites 100 years ago.
Yeah, but that's interesting because against this more like harsh discourse or restrictions placed on women, I think women themselves, the feminist consciousness have been developing quite rapidly against this like difficulties they envisioned, experienced. And I think especially the end of the one-child policy and had a quite huge impact on women's life, not just as mothers, but also as daughters. As an only child myself, I have to say that like it's perhaps quite bad to say it, but I think I benefited a bit from the one-child policy because it sort of curbed the enthusiasm for some preference during a certain period of time, and then give girls more opportunity to have a higher education and also subsequently job opportunities, but it's not the same anymore. So I guess that kind of resentment was quite common among women as well. A bit like a disappointment with what is going on, and also the betrayal of previous Maoist slogan that women could hold up half the sky.
Absolutely. We have a question from Tara Hung. She says, what do you think about the concept of women in war or nationalism in earlier ages and the present? For example, there was poetry of Mulan in earlier ages. However, the woman is seen or shaped to be a tiger mother or invisible in nationalism. What do you think?
Well, I think the legend of Hua Mulan continued to inspire many women during the 20th century. And I didn't really mention too much about military women, but some of them did join the army and they forced, such as the North Expedition. And it's, in a sense, I see a continuation instead of a sudden stop of what was going on back then.
Thank you. And I think we'll have to make this the final question, and it's the kind of question that historians don't like, because you've been asked a question about the future, which is not our period. But Guxing Chen wants to know, what will mother's role be like in the next 20 years?
Well, yeah, that's a question that historians don't like, because I don't feel like I could predict the future, and especially when I'm not a mom myself. But I feel like because women are more aware of the burdens of motherhood and duties of motherhood more than before, and especially in this age that the competition has been enormously fierce, especially in China. So I think women would be more cautious choosing that if they want to enter motherhood. And if they did, I hope that they know what they're doing. But I can't really speak on behalf of our Chinese women and mothers.
Yeah. Well, I might just allow this final question to sneak in, because I think it's quite an important one. Ed Von asked, what do you think about this consideration of the very notion of woman being constructed by mainstream discourse, but dominated by heterosexuality?
Yeah, I think that's another thing I didn't really discuss about the emergence of lesbianism, especially in the girls' schools, as that was a quite controversial topic during the Republican period. And sorry, can you repeat the question again? I think yeah.
Well, essentially, the question is about the way that discourse is. I have my own child here. Sorry.
Mommy, is that a tiger?
Yes, it's a tiger. The way in which the discourse of women is dominated by heterosexuality in both potentially today and also historically.
Yeah, I think it's quite important, because heteronormativity is still something quite, sorry, I can't really hear you, Isabella. You're on mute, I think. Should I continue? Okay, right. Sorry, yeah, I was saying that, yeah, I think it's a really important question because even my own talk was made the same mistake, that it was based on very heteronormative foundation. And because I can't really speak for the situation in the West, because the LGBTQ movement has obviously advancing quite quickly, a lot quicker than in China. But as it's still something a bit taboo in China now. So yeah, I think it's important to realize that the marriage is not just between men and women. And but yeah, that, sorry, I think it's not a very coherent answer, but I think, yeah, this is just a reminder that I made the same mistake myself in my own in my own talk.
Well, I don't think you should blame yourself for that as a mistake. I think it is something that the whole kind of discipline is only just coming to grips with. Thank you very much indeed. I think we will draw things to a close there, but thank you for such a rich talk, and thank you for handling such a diverse array of questions so ably, and thank you to all the audience for your very well-informed questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the festivities with the Dublin Lunar New Year Festival. Thank you very much to them for organising, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.